You're listening to Kitchen Table Finance. Join Dave Shotwell and Nick Nauta as they cut through the complexity of financial planning and serve bites of investment advice that are both personal and practical.
Hey Dave, how you doing today?
I am doing great, Nick. How are you?
I am well, thank you.
Excellent.
Happy summer. I'm sure
Happy
this
summer.
is your favorite time of the
Friday
year,
in the
right?
summer. Hey, the temperatures broke. I'm wearing a reasonably light but not heavy, not uncomfortably light shirt, and I've got blue
Yeah,
jeans on. So
yeah.
this is my
There you
kind of summer
go.
day.
There you go. We've been drinking our air around here lately with the
Right.
humidity, but
Yep.
I kind of like that weather. So
You
at
can
least in
you can
small
pretty much say in
stretches.
Michigan year round, it's not so much the heat, it's the weather or the humidity, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Good and
For
bad.
sure.
All right.
So, good topic today, Dave. This is something that you and I deal with a lot with
Yeah.
clients, and that is how do I create an income stream in retirement, right? So, I got
Right.
all these different pieces that I've been saving and putting towards retirement. And now that I've kind of gotten to that point,
Yeah.
the finish line, which is really the starting line, like how do I put it all together? How do I make it make sense? How do I live on that?
Yeah, on one level, it's a deceptively simple question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe it seems deceptively simple to you and me because we deal with it every day, but it can't be that simple because we get this question all the time from people
Yeah,
that are getting ready to go into retirement.
right.
How do I take all this money I've accumulated and now live on it?
Well, I think you're right. I think it's like deceptively simple because like the common, like if you look around or do a Google search or ask Chat GPT or something like that, right? Been this long standing like, hey, you can take 4% out of your accounts every year
Hmm.
adjusted for inflation. And that's kind of been like the rule of thumb forever, right?
Right,
Like,
right.
so I think like the information that's out there is simple, but it's not, and like in practice, it's much more complex than that, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so yeah, it's our bread and butter. It's what we do. How
Yeah.
do you go from being a 64, 65-year-old fully employed paycheck person to taking that 401k or 403b and Social Security and maybe a pension and turning it
Right.
into lifetime paychecks?
Yeah. Yep. So, I mean, I guess like you kind of described there, the first step is taking, an assessment of all of the resources
Right,
that you do have coming in, right?
right, and start with like the known things, right? The
Mm-hmm.
set things. Most people that we work with have Social Security.
Yep.
Some of them have a pension. We work with some state
Mm-hmm.
of Michigan employees that still have traditional pensions to go with their
Sure.
retirement income. Um, and then it seems more and more common that we're
Yeah.
working with people that, financial reasons aside, and we've talked about this in other podcasts quite a bit, they plan to work in some capacity during retirement.
Right.
We can't always quantify that easily. But
Mm-hmm.
when we're doing it in a formal plan, I usually try to either we say, "Hey, I'm just going to work and it's just going to be for fun, and I don't care how much I make, so let's not count it,"
Right.
or we come up with some like reasonable conservative estimate, like, "Hey, I'll probably make $1,000 a month or two thousand
Right.
dollars a month minimum."
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, start by trying to quantify what your resources are outside of your portfolio.
Yep. Well, and it's interesting because all of those resources have decisions that have to be made and things that need to be thought about, right? It's not just
Right.
like, hey, I'm Social Security age, I'm going to turn that on.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I suppose, is like what age do I start and what
Yeah.
amount is that going to be? And if I don't
Yeah.
start right away, what is that going to grow to? And how does that plan with the other resources I have, right?
Yeah, and you and I may approach this a little bit differently in action with clients, but I usually default when I'm building a plan and haven't discussed a lot of the details with a client yet, I'll default to drawing Social Security at full retirement age, assuming the
Mm-hmm.
client's already retired at that point. It's just to kind of give us a baseline
Yeah.
starting point.
Yep.
And then from there we can after we've kind of developed the plan, look at, okay, does it make more sense to delay Social Security to 70?
Hmm.
Spoiler alert, a lot of times it does. Usually it
Yeah.
does, but there's
Right.
nuances to that. Um, and then same with pensions. If it's a husband and wife, I would normally default to doing 100% spousal coverage and work back from that,
Yeah. Right.
you know. So at least, so if you're out there trying to do this on your own, maybe start with, kind of a base assumption, and then you can kind of think about your values and choices around that once you've kind of got a baseline.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. I was just having a conversation about this with a client, and they told me that like everything that they have seen online was all about like take Social Security at 62, which is, I guess it's just like a stark reminder of like the Google algorithm that
Yeah.
some people get are very different because everything that I see and everything that I look at is like
Well,
waiting until longer, right?
right. Well, I think some of that is the advisor echo chamber, right? And I find
Hmm.
myself seeing advisors be like, why would anybody draw Social Security before age 70? And I push back on that, right?
Yeah, right, for
Um,
sure.
it is usually a good choice for
Hmm.
most people. Most of the people we work with, that's what the numbers would say.
Right.
There are so many nuances to that.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, like
It,
what's your personal, what are your goals? What's your personal outlook on longevity? What's your personal outlook on risk? There's so much to it.
right. Well, as I am famous for saying, if we were just looking at the numbers, right, you would never
Right,
retire. You'd be living
right,
in a cardboard box and you'd be saving and investing everything because that's how the
right,
numbers grow.
right, right, right.
Retirement wouldn't be a thing.
Yeah, yeah. So, just come up with some reasonable assumptions that work for you. Make a
Hmm.
baseline case, then you can play games with scenarios after that. But
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like you have to find a starting point, right? You got to start
right,
somewhere. You got to, and then kind of work in and work back out through all those decisions to kind
yeah,
of see A, like what do the numbers do, but B, also keeping in mind, like, how am I feeling emotionally about this, right?
yeah,
Like, how's this going to represent what I want to do and what I emotionally might be able to do, depending on when I start taking things, what I take, that kind of thing.
right. And I guess as a kind of another little side note, real quick, is a lot of times when I see people do some of this work on their own, they forget to account for taxes.
Yes.
So, you know, figure out your income streams, but also remember that Social Security and pensions are taxable, at least
Yeah.
a portion of them, and factor that into that. The next step when we're talking about spending needs,
Hmm.
it's the net amount that you're getting from Social Security that's going to matter, right?
Right. Yep.
So, when we talk about goals with clients going through financial planning, we try to get as nuanced as we can with different types of goals and specifics because I think we find it's easier for people to visualize them if we're more specific about them.
Yeah.
For do-it-yourselfers, I would say, try to break things into two main categories.
Yep.
Think about those basic spending things that are non-negotiable. Your rent, your car payment, your mortgage payment if you have one,
Yeah.
utilities, um, basics, food and that kind of thing. And then maybe a broader discretionary category that if things aren't working out very well, you can reasonably cut back on travel, that kind of thing.
Right. I think that's a great like and part of me is like it depends on like how close you are to retirement, right? Like when
Hmm.
you are like a year out or so, you should be real dialed into like specifics of what exactly these numbers
Right.
are.
Yeah,
If
that's a
you're
good point.
5 or more years out, like maybe kind of figuring, okay, what's my take home now? Let's plan on replacing that is a pretty decent
Yeah.
starting point. That's going to get you probably pretty close.
Yeah, when we
Um,
work with younger clients, a lot of times we'll frame it as let's just talk about replacing your current lifestyle,
right.
right? Which
Yeah.
is
Hmm.
usually, rules of thumb, a percentage of your current take home pay. Um, because you're not going to know. You're just not going to
Yeah.
know with any
Right.
exactitude.
Right. So once we kind of, figure out what your spending is and breaking it into, like you said, like the basic and discretionary, and like I love the benefit of that is like if you had to cut back on things, because that's
Hmm.
going to be part of your like thought process, right? Like how close do I get to that, and am I comfortable cutting that back, or should I work a couple more years so I don't,
Right.
there's less likelihood that has to happen. Like those are some considerations to make. But once you kind of look at those expenses, then what's next?
Well, we need to look at what's the gap between those set
Right.
income things that Social Security,
Yep.
pension, etc., and your basic spending would be one gap, and then adding to that your discretionary spending too. I would kind of think about it in two pieces like that,
Hmm.
um, because that's the part that's got to come from your savings.
Right.
And when we talk about rules of thumb like withdrawal rates, back to the 4% that you mentioned
Hmm.
earlier, it's a good starting point to try to aim for not exceeding that in terms of what you need to take from your portfolio. And if you're finding that it's going to take a 5% withdrawal rate, 6% withdrawal rate, then you need to back up and look at spending, look at retirement timing.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because when we do income planning, right, it's never like a static 4%,
Right.
right? Like some years, at the beginning, it might be closer to 10% because we're waiting
If
on
they're
Social
delaying
Security.
Social Security. Right. Right.
And then it might go down to 2% after we start Social
Right.
Security. So it's never like a static, like, hey, we're just going to take 4% out of this every year. And that's going to be that, right? There's
Right.
always usually some fluctuation in that, which is pretty normal when we're trying to like fill that gap. And going back to the whole Social Security, whether you should delay or start right away, some people, and I get this a lot, that they just think that they have to start Social Security when they retire. So if they're going to delay, that means that they have to wait, and that's not
Right.
necessarily the case, right? Like you can take more money out of your portfolio in those years where you're not taking Social Security, but sometimes people misconstrue like how that works.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, really at that point, then what we're normally doing with clients is figuring out an asset allocation that fits them from a risk tolerance standpoint and generating enough return so that their plan works out well over time.
Hmm.
And then, if their gap is $2,000 a month that they need, we'll set up an automated distribution from their retirement funds
Yep.
and in terms of choosing what to sell, the way we do it is we've got a portfolio broken into a dozen or so funds, and they're each assigned a percentage. And every month we look and say, okay, this fund is a higher percentage than it's assigned, either because the other funds went down relative to it or it went up. But we
Right.
first take from the overweight funds
Hmm.
to kind of
Hmm.
bring the portfolio back in line. We create the cash needed and we send that out.
Yep.
Part of it is also generated from interest and dividends, but
Hmm.
that money goes into the cash part of the portfolio. So if there's more cash in the account than it should be, that goes out.
Hmm.
But it's basically a process of rebalancing the account back to our targets every month so that we know the risk level of the portfolio stays where the client needs it to be
Right.
and they're consistently able to draw. And as long as we're drawing a reasonable percentage, we should be in good shape.
Yeah. Yep. So it's kind of that forced, like, buy low. Now we're at the selling phase, right? So we're
Yes.
forcing ourselves to sell high because we're selling more of the positions that are doing well.
Yeah. Um, Go ahead. Sorry.
Lots. I was just gonna say, like, lots of considerations go into that, though, because what most people come to us with isn't like, "Hey, I've got this one retirement fund," right? It's
Right.
usually like, "Hey, I've got a 401k over here that's all pre-tax, and I've got a Roth
Yeah.
IRA, and I've got an account that I'm paying taxes on ongoing. And
Yeah.
so then we have to kind of figure out like what are the considerations for where you're going to be at taxably, and how do we decide which one of those accounts to pull from, how much to pull from it, do we pull from multiple? Like it gets a little bit more complicated when you start thinking about how taxes play into it.
Yeah. And, there's some simple rules of thumb here again. The broad rules of thumb are that you'd spend your after-tax dollars first, so money
Yep.
outside of your 401k or 403b or IRA,
Mm-hmm.
then your pre-tax dollars once you've used those up. Once you've used your after-tax money up, then you would
Yep.
use your pre-tax 401k, 403b money, and then later in retirement, your Roth money.
Right.
With the logic being you want that Roth to grow as long as possible at tax-free rates.
Yep. Yeah. So kind of the thought process behind that is let's get rid of the stuff that I have to pay taxes on every year.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll start working on the stuff that I'm going to have to pay taxes on eventually and take RMDs, but and then I've got all this tax-free stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like in the perfect world, that's kind of like the general rule of thumb. However, we
It's never
live in
that
the real
simple.
world.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So, just some general guiding principles. I don't A lot of times this is a discussion with the client about priorities and goals and
Hmm.
how they perceive their money over time, because there's instances where preserving the money in the Roth makes the most sense. There are other times when there's reasons to keep after tax money
Yeah.
and not exhaust it all, and
Right.
how these things play out. Um, there are instances where, like, I've got a few clients where their main estate beneficiaries are nonprofits.
Hmm.
So, leaving those nonprofits their pre-tax dollars instead of spending those earlier in retirement makes more sense. So
Yeah,
there's some things to consider with spending order.
for sure.
Also, our the average. I don't know. I hate to paint with broad brushes, but a lot of the folks we deal with would have the significant bulk of their money in pre-tax
Right.
investments.
Yeah.
Maybe 10% of their money is in after-tax portfolios,
Right.
and I include, CDs and savings there too. And
Hmm.
then the bulk of their money they've saved diligently for 30 years out of their paychecks, it's pre-tax, and maybe they have a little bit in Roth
Right.
on top of that.
Yeah.
So when we're turning a portfolio into a paycheck, if they've got $50,000 in after-tax money and $750,000 in pre-tax money, we can't really make a consistent paycheck out of $50,000. And
Right.
we don't necessarily want to spend all that down to zero anyway. So it may
Yeah.
be like, this is your emergency fund in the
Hmm.
bank of $50,000, maybe a little bit of, investments in there too. And we're going to start right away making that paycheck
Right.
from your IRA, from your pre-tax investments. So there's some balancing to go on there.
Yeah. Well, and to go back to your point about like beneficiaries of like if your plan is to have money left over, right?
Hmm.
Need to start considering not only like the income tax ramifications of your retirement, but also what are the tax ramifications of your beneficiaries, and like how do you want to see that play out, because those are, and
Hmm.
especially with some of the changes in rules of now you have to take your pre-tax funds out over 10 years. That kind of
If they're
complicates
inherited,
potentially
yeah,
things.
yeah.
So there's a lot more consideration that goes into income taxes now. But with the caveat to that being like in the airplane, right? Like first take care of yourself, put your own mask on.
Right,
Like
right,
if there's money left over, great. We can deal with that and plan with that. But let's make sure you're okay first before
right.
we start worrying about like what's the next generation is going to potentially inherit and what the tax ramifications of that
Yeah,
are.
and I guess the way I would leave it for now is, when you're thinking about taxes over your lifetime, think about targeting like an average tax rate.
Right.
And the conventional wisdom a lot of times is I want to pay as low a tax bill as I can in this given year. But sometimes in retirement planning, having a low tax plan or low tax income plan early in retirement means you're going to have a high tax plan later in retirement.
Right. Yeah.
So there are obviously instances there where taking some taxes earlier in retirement saves you money in the long run.
Yeah, it's a interesting dynamic, interesting to think about. I mean, one of the hard parts of like tax planning in retirement and income and thinking about your income plan in terms of taxes is, most people that were planning their retirements were planning on 30 years. And I will
Right.
guarantee you that tax law is going to change multiple times in 30 years. So you might have the best plan ever, but it can all fall
Right.
apart if some of the laws change, some of the rules change.
Right.
And so it's always something to consider, but we don't want it to like drive all of the decision making either, right?
Yeah.
Like it's certainly a consideration, but it shouldn't be the only priority we think about.
So our normal approach for most clients is to create this withdrawal strategy from their
Yep.
portfolio where we've
Mhm.
got some rules about what we're going to sell and when we're going to take it. The other alternatives, now that interest rates are higher again, I expect this is going to come up more often. But when I started, when interest rates were higher back in the early
Mm.
2000s, it was quite common for investors to try to invest all their principal in things that produce dividends and interest and
Yep.
just live off the dividends and
Yeah.
interest. Well, back, at that point, you could get close to that
Right.
safe withdrawal rate, and consistent dividends and interest. It's not easy, but it's getting easier again now.
Yeah.
So there's pros and cons to that. I don't think it's necessarily a bad strategy. I think it's more a psychological strategy.
Mm. Hmm.
Um, People feel it feels more conservative to say, "Hey, I'm going to invest $1 million in things that are going to produce 3 to 5% interest, and I'm just going to spend that interest in dividends. And if that's not there for whatever reason, I'm not selling investments to create
Right.
them."
Yep.
And there's some advantages to that and some disadvantages. I think that's a whole nother,
Sure.
hour-long podcast probably.
Right.
But the bottom line is, if you're going to do that, just it's a conscious choice that you're probably giving up some upside return
Hmm.
potential. It may make management more complicated because you've got to watch, you're taking on much more interest rate risk then in your
Right.
portfolio
Yeah.
generally. So, um,
It's a interesting thought, especially right now, because I'm sure some of our astute listeners are like, "Why would I take a 4% withdrawal when I could go buy a 1-year CD at 5% and just take the interest off of that?"
that
Right?
that would work great for like the next 12 months probably.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
After
and
that, and well, I think that's part of the problem, right? Is like the strategy of taking the dividends and interest means that your income is going to vary widely, and most
Right,
people are used to a pretty consistent, pretty steady income, right?
right, right.
So, like, unless you're in a sales role your whole life where you went from feast to famine to feast to
And
famine
you're
every
used to
year, like, you're
that. Yeah,
probably not used to having a bunch of money one year and not very
yeah.
much the next year or next 5 years, and kind of. So,
Well,
it's an interesting thought for sure.
yeah, and I remember it's been a while, but going through those conversations with people that were in their 70s in the early 2000s who were used to being able and what ends up happening if you're not careful is when interest rates go down, then you do what we call in the business reach for yield. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess a good rule of thumb, and I didn't mean to go too far down this trail, but if one investment is yielding higher than another investment, there's a reason, and it's
Right.
risk, right?
Yep.
If we're talking about stocks and one is paying a 5% dividend and one's paying a 4% dividend, that's because the market perceives the 5% stock as riskier.
Yeah.
And if it was less risk, people would buy it up until it was only yielding 4%.
Right.
Okay. True of bonds. It's true of just about anything else. I can't think of anything where yield basically tells you what the market's perceived risk relative to other similar investments would be.
Yeah.
So what
Mm-hmm.
happens is if interest rates go down and you're trying to maintain 5% and now, you can't, your CD's coming due and or your bonds are coming due, whatever that instrument is, and now a bond just like it is at 3%. Well, you're going to turn around and say, well, I want a 5% bond. Well, then
Right.
you're buying junkier and longer stuff.
Right. Yep.
So you've got to watch that. Anyway,
Mm-hmm. So we would be remiss to have a retirement income podcast day without talking about annuities and income annuities and how
true.
they how they're probably sold to people, but B, how you can and maybe should use them as a part of an income strategy.
Yeah. So one line of thinking would be, if back to the idea of that gap, right? You've got Social
Mm-hmm.
Security, maybe a pension, and it comes to you're expecting $4,000 a month in income, and you need 5 or 6.
Yeah.
So one school of thought is you can take part of your portfolio and purchase an annuity that is going to guarantee that that gap is filled.
Yep.
And there's nothing wrong with that strategy per
No.
se. You just have to be conscious of the pros and cons.
Yep.
So with the big thing for me is how much of your portfolio would it take to fill that gap is the first
Yep.
thing to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a small the irony is, if it's a small enough gap that you don't need a lot of your portfolio to fill it, the less risk you have of not filling it, right? I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
you get if you only need $300 a month from an annuity to close that gap, and that only requires $100,000 of your portfolio, and you've got a million, you don't really
Right.
need to worry about it, right?
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
the bigger the gap is, the more it's going to cost you to fill that, and the more
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
downside there is
For
to
sure.
closing.
Yeah, so I
So
would think, like you said, like the gap, the amount, or the percentage of your portfolio, and then I would
hmm
also think of it in terms of like the overall risk that you're willing to take. In
hmm
terms of like if you are very risk averse,
hmm
it might be a good option for you because there's going to be times when things don't go well, right? Like one of the things that we didn't talk about, but when we create a retirement income stream, we then go out and try to break it, right? Like
right,
we look at all the possible
what can go
potential
wrong?
returns
Yeah,
of the market, what can go wrong, and how will this portfolio survive if we're taking money out of it. But it's one thing to have a portfolio survive. It's another thing to live through it and be able
right.
to stomach it. And so sometimes if you're very risk averse, it does make sense
Well,
to take
and
a look at something like that.
another component to that thinking is back to that division between basic spending needs and discretionary spending needs, and
Mm-hmm.
your mindset. If you can if your basic spending needs are met from your set income sources, or only a small percentage isn't, and you're willing to say, okay, if we're in the middle of a bear market next year, I'm just not going to go on a vacation, and I'm okay with that. That's a
Right.
whole different mindset than, I'm not going to be able to pay my rent, or I'm not going to be
Yes.
able to make my car payment if the market goes down.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's a little more important to ensure that income.
Yeah.
Um, or if you just can't live without the vacation,
Yeah.
which is fine. My wife would probably be on board with that. So,
Well, that I guess that plays into it too, right? Like, how do you have a high Social Security? Do you have a pension?
yeah,
Like, if you have multiple fixed income streams already, guaranteed income streams, maybe you don't need a third, right? Like, you
right.
probably don't need 110% coverage of guaranteed income streams. But if you have maybe you don't have a great Social Security for whatever reason, and you don't have a pension, maybe it does make sense to fill that gap a little bit.
With something. Yeah.
Right?
But the flip side is, you are always going to be giving something up to get
Yes.
that guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
There's no free lunch. If you expect a return greater than cash, you're taking some risk, some expense to get that.
Yep.
And if a product is filling that role and guaranteeing you things, you're either giving up upside potential, giving up liquidity, paying higher ongoing costs than you would have to get that insurance built into the annuity product. There is something there that is
Right.
allowing you to give that risk to the insurance company.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. And again, that's fine. You can make a
Mm-hmm.
conscious decision that I don't want that risk myself. I'm willing to pay a little bit to have that covered. Just recognize that that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I guess, my point of view is
Mm-hmm.
get that opinion from someone who's not paid a large commission to sell
Yes.
you an annuity.
Yes.
Whether, we're very proud of the fact that we can look, I still tend to be anti-annuity, but
Yep.
I can at least look at them for a client and know that the decision needs to be the client's and based on their
Oh yeah.
values and what they want to do. And we'll disclose all those costs. We're not going to just show them the benefits, which
Right.
is one of my big beefs with how annuities are sold.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing, right? Like just knowing what your options are and knowing like what the pros and cons of that decision are. Most of the people that come in here who have annuities have very little understanding of what they have or what they're
Right.
paying for it or why they have it. And that's the problem, right? If you went into
Right.
that decision and you knew exactly what you were getting and why you were getting it and what it was costing you, like I would have no problem with that. We have done that for clients in
Right.
the past. We will do that for clients in the future where it makes sense. But the number of people that don't understand those things is somewhat alarming. So I'll
Yeah.
get off my soapbox now.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll just leave it at that. Make sure you get an objective opinion. We're not the only ones out there that can do that for you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
find a fee only planner that can give you a realistic understanding of what you're buying.
For sure. And for some people it makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah.
And it's
Well,
a good fit. For other
and
people, not so much.
and the annuity world has evolved because of these
Mm,
criticisms and is
for
getting
sure.
better so
Yeah,
that fee only
absolutely.
advisors can provide these products when they're appropriate. The
Yeah.
big deal is it's an objective playing field or level
Yeah.
playing field.
Yeah, for
So,
sure. For sure. So that pretty much wraps up our how to create an income stream in retirement, Dave. We actually talked a lot about tax planning, which I don't think we really
yeah, I
planned
think we
on,
raised
but
more issues than we probably answered for people, but
the good news is we do have that on our list of things to talk about, tax planning and retirement. So look for that episode coming out
yep.
here in the future. But if you have any questions on creating a retirement income stream, have any thoughts on this episode, feel free to shoot us an email at info@srbadvisors.com. We love hearing from you. And as always, Dave, it has been a pleasure, my friend.
Love it, Nick. Thanks.
This is a Zedia Media production.